Will you join me in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, holy God, our rock and redeemer. Amen. I'm going to try something a little bit different today. The more I studied the text for this week, the more I wondered about the man with an unclean spirit. I wondered what his life was like before that day when Jesus taught and healed in the Capernaum synagogue, and what his life was like after. I wondered what he might say to us if he could. So I'm not going to leave the pulpit for now. In fact, I'm going to stay here because I'm on paper. But the rest of this sermon is going to be my imagination of how this man might tell us his own story. We didn't have air conditioning back then. We didn't have electric fans. Those wouldn't come for almost 2,000 years. And the heat in the summer in Capernaum was relentless. It was much cooler in the synagogue. The thick stone walls retained the cool evening air. There was a wooden roof with kind of gaps at the sides that would let heat rise out. Usually I could stay there for a while before they made me leave. I don't know what you call people like me now. You've sorted us all out into categories: schizophrenia, Tourette syndrome, bipolar. Then we were just all called demoniacs. Or they might say that we were en pneumati akatharto, with an unclean spirit. There are different names for it these days. There were pills and things. But in a lot of ways it wasn't so different. There are still people like me wandering around with nowhere to go. People still act the same way around us, looking at the ground and hoping we'll go away soon. No matter whether you call us schizophrenic or possessed, whatever you call it, I was different. I was unpredictable. I heard things that other people didn't hear. Sometimes I would just know that something was true and people would not believe me. I heard voices sometimes. They told me to do things, and I knew something bad would happen if I didn't do what they said. I was usually pretty jumpy because centurions were always watching me and following me, although my brother said I was imagining it, that they had better things to do with their time. I shouted a lot. Sometimes to tell the centurions I was onto them, sometimes because voices said to. I didn't want to be like this. I didn't want the voices, the thoughts in my head, but I couldn't stop them, no matter what I did. Prayer, healers, nothing. Nothing changed it. I lived with my brother and his wife, but they didn't like me hanging around the house all day. I heard my sister-in-law say she didn't like me home with just her and the children. Sometimes I would try to help my brother with his work. He was a fisherman. But I couldn't always do that. A lot of days he said he just couldn't deal with me out there in the boat. I liked the synagogue, though, because it was cool and quiet, but not too quiet. It was calming, sometimes, to sit and think, while the people were studying, praying, and talking. I liked the music, too. I liked the songs. I was sitting in the synagogue one Sabbath, that Saturday for you, when a man I'd never met before came. He had some guys with him. I recognized a couple of them. They were Zebedee's boys. He walked up to read something from the Torah, and then he sat down and began to talk about the passage he had just read. That raised some eyebrows. Everyday people don't really do that. That's more for the scribes and the educated people. Who knew who this guy was wandering around with a bunch of fishermen? But after a few words, he had everyone's attention. He told these stories, and none of us quite understood what they meant, but you just wanted to keep thinking about them. He said that God loves and blesses poor people and people who are hungry. I wondered if he would tell what God thought about me. That's when I started to get excited. When I get excited, that can actually be a pretty bad thing. When my mind gets busier, there are often more voices, more shouting, more acting strange. So first I started to get a little bit excited, and then I stood up and started pacing back and forth, and I felt like I had to shout. I knew the guys at the synagogue wouldn't like it. I tried to hold it in, but I kept hearing these words. And then I shouted them. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? We know who you are, the Holy One of God. Joel, who helps run the synagogue, rolled his eyes and sighed. He's usually the one who has to tell me to leave. Jesus looked frightened for a second. People usually are when I shout. And then his face softened and he asked, "How did you know my name?" I don't know how I knew his name. It's just what I shouted. I had to keep shouting. I knew I had to, or something bad would happen, so I shouted more. What have you to do with us? He came towards me, and he put his hands on my shoulders. He looked really stern. Please stop shouting, he said. But I kept shouting. I had to keep shouting. And then he was shouting too. Be silent and come out of him. Be silent and come out of him. I get angry at myself when I shout, because I try to stop it and I get so frustrated when I do it anyway. Sometimes people get angry and they yell at me. It's not fair that they're so angry at me for something I can't help. But Jesus wasn't angry at me. I could tell. He was angry at the voices that were making me shout, and he wanted them to stop as much as I wanted them to stop. He was angry at them, not angry at me. And he was shouting for them to be silent, shouting for them to go away, to leave me forever. Be silent and come out of him. I kept shouting, and he kept shouting, and I kept shouting. He kept shouting. No one had ever acted like that when I was shouting, like they weren't afraid of me, like they knew that I was still there, that I was still me, that there was a me separate from the shouting and the voices and the strange things I said and did sometimes. Like they actually saw me. I started to weep. I was shaking. I wasn't shouting anymore. I kind of wanted to run away, just get out of there as fast as I could, but I wanted to stay near Jesus. All the other men were glaring at me, and Jesus still had a hand on my shoulder, and he looked right back at them. It was like he really knew and saw them, too, imperfections and all. It was like he knew that Joel got irritated about tiny little things at the synagogue being exactly perfect, and Samuel was always trying to be the center of attention, and he talked so much and he never wanted to listen, and Levi and Joshua couldn't stop bickering with each other over things that didn't matter at all. Jesus looked at them glaring at me like, well, you think he's the only one who struggles? And Joel said, Jesus, why don't you sit down and tell us more about that guy on the Jericho road? And that's what Jesus did. I think people read my story these days and they assume that I was normal from then on. They figure that whatever was wrong with me Jesus fixed it that day, and that was that. Well, yes and no. I was definitely better. Maybe a lot better. I think that after that day with Jesus, I shouted less. I didn't worry so much about centurions. Sometimes when things were getting bad, I would remember Jesus and what he said and did that day, and it would calm me down. It would bring me back. But something else happened, too. Joel and Samuel and everyone who was there that day treated me differently from then on. They weren't so afraid of me. And when I was yelling or muttering or pacing, sometimes they just talked to me. I think that when Jesus and I shouted at each other in the synagogue that day, he changed the way we all thought about each other and ourselves. Because all those guys, they're not perfect. We all have things about ourselves that we would change if we could. We all have ways that we're broken. Mine is right out on the surface for everyone to see, and everyone saw it that day. And Jesus said in every way he knew how that I mattered and I belonged anyway. He said in every way that he could that God loved me and that those people in the synagogue, they should love me too. God goes and finds the lost sheep, he said. God loves all those people on the edges. And God loves the people whose brokenness isn't so easy to see. Like the priests who walked past that beaten-up guy on the Jericho road. Like the responsible brother who got all ticked off when his irresponsible brother came home okay and his dad threw a party. Jesus told us every way he knew how. With his words, and then with his actions, and then with his words again. And the miracle is that all of us heard him. Things are different around the synagogue now. Sometimes I get to read from the Torah, even. I learned how when I was a kid. When I have a bad day, if I shout too much or I say something horrible or mean, Joel still tells me I have to leave. No blasphemy in the synagogue, he says. Or, you can't be so loud here. You need to leave now. But other times, Joel comes and sits by me and talks to me. Even if I am having a hard day, he just talks to me. And I talk to him. The other guys are nicer to me too, and sometimes they call me over to sit with them while they study. It's like everyone can see me. Like when Jesus sent away my voices that were making me shout, he sent away everyone else's voices too, the voices that make people fear me, hate me, and ignore me. I think we're starting to be friends, maybe. I think that's how Jesus wanted it to be. I think that is how Jesus wants it to be. Thanks be to God.